They say love is blind, but I never realized how true that was until I found myself staring at the wreckage of a 7-year relationship, wondering how I'd missed so many red flags along the way. This is the story of how I discovered that the person I thought I knew better than anyone was living a double life, and how I'm still struggling to let go of someone who clearly let go of me long ago. 7 years. That's how long I gave of my life to someone I thought would be my forever. When you're young and in love, 7 years feels like a lifetime, and in many ways, it was my entire adult life up to that point. I met James during my 2nd year of university. I was shy, introverted, with a small circle of close friends and a tendency to keep people at arm's length. My family life had been complicated. My father's infidelity had torn our family apart when I was younger, and I'd watched my mother endure years of betrayal and gaslighting. Maybe that's why I was so cautious about relationships, so careful about who I let into my heart. But James was different. Or at least, I thought he was. He was patient with my walls, understanding about my past, supportive in ways I'd never experienced before. While my friends were dating casually, going to parties, living that typical college experience, I found myself building a life that revolved around 3 things: my family, my studies, and him. Looking back, I can see how I made him my entire world. When you have a small social circle and you're naturally introverted, it's easy to pour all your emotional energy into one person. James became my home, my comfort zone, my safe space in a world that often felt overwhelming. For 5 good years, it felt like the right choice. He was there through late-night study sessions, family dramas, moments of self-doubt. When I decided to pursue my master's thesis, a grueling 2-year commitment that would consume most of my time and energy, he was nothing but supportive. "I'll be here when you're done," he'd say. "Focus on your work. I'm not going anywhere." I believed him completely. If I'm being honest, there were issues from early on that I should have paid more attention to. The problems with James's family weren't dramatic or explosive. They were subtle, insidious, the kind of thing that eats away at you slowly over time. It started with small comments, little digs that could be passed off as jokes or cultural differences. James came from a very traditional family where the expectation was that girlfriends should be grateful for whatever attention they received, where family always came first, where a woman's role was clearly defined and limited. I tried to fit in at first. I really did. I attended family gatherings, brought gifts, tried to engage with his relatives. But there were 2 incidents that crystallized everything for me, moments that I can still replay in perfect detail because of how deeply they cut. The first happened during a family dinner about 3 years into our relationship. I'd been spending a lot of time with James, probably too much, in retrospect, but we were young and in love and it felt natural. His mother pulled him aside after dinner, but she spoke loud enough for me to hear. "You shouldn't let her expect so much of your time," she said. "You have a family, responsibilities. She needs to understand that she can't be your priority." I sat there, pretending to look at my phone while my heart pounded in my chest. James said something quietly in response, but he didn't defend me. He didn't explain that I'd never demanded his time, that our relationship was built on mutual choice, not expectation. He just let it slide. The second incident was even worse. We were at a family celebration, and one of James's aunts was talking about young people today, how they don't respect family values anymore. She looked directly at me and said, "Nowadays, When young people have girlfriends, they forget about their families completely. The implication was clear: I was the problem. I was the outsider pulling James away from what really mattered. And once again, James said nothing. He just gave me that look that meant ignore it, don't make a scene. But how do you ignore someone essentially calling you a threat to their family? How do you pretend that doesn't hurt when you're sitting right there, when you've done nothing but try to be respectful and kind? These moments brought back visceral memories of my childhood, watching my mother endure similar treatment from my father's family. The subtle dismissals, the implications that she wasn't quite good enough, the expectation that she should be grateful for whatever scraps of acceptance she received. I started making excuses to skip family gatherings. I'd claim I was sick, or had too much schoolwork, or just wasn't feeling up to it. James would ask why, and I'd try to explain how uncomfortable his family made me feel, how their comments hurt, how I needed him to stand up for me. Just ignore them, he'd say. They don't mean anything by it. That's just how they are. But that's the thing about microaggressions: they're designed to be dismissible individually while being devastating cumulatively. Each comment was small enough that calling it out seemed like an overreaction, but together they created an environment where I never felt welcome, never felt valued, never felt like I belonged. And James's response to all of this was always the same: ignore it, don't rock the boat, keep the peace. He was conflict avoidant by nature, someone who would rather smooth things over than address uncomfortable truths. At the time, I told myself this was just his personality, that he wasn't confrontational and that was okay. Now I realize it was cowardice. The last 2 years of our relationship coincided with my master's thesis work. Anyone who's been through graduate school knows how consuming that process can be: the research, the writing, the constant pressure, the isolation. I was buried in academic work, spending 12 to 14 hours a day in the library or at my computer, surviving on coffee and anxiety. James was incredible during this period, at least on the surface. He'd bring me food when I forgot to eat, drive me to the library when I was too tired to take public transport, listen to me vent about my advisor or my research problems. He seemed to understand that this was temporary, that once I finished my thesis, we'd have all the time in the world to focus on our relationship again. But the stress was taking its toll on both of us. I became withdrawn, anxious, completely absorbed in my work. Our physical intimacy suffered. I was either too tired, too stressed, or too worried about getting pregnant to want sex. I know this was hard on James, and I take full responsibility for my part in the distance that grew between us during this time. What I didn't know was that while I was struggling through the most challenging period of my academic life, James was seeking connection elsewhere. I was so focused on my thesis, so trusting in our relationship, that it never occurred to me to check his phone or question where he was when he wasn't with me. In 7 years together, I'd never felt the need to be suspicious or paranoid. I trusted him completely, believed in us completely. That trust was the foundation of our relationship, and it was also what allowed him to betray me so thoroughly. The revelation came in the most mundane way possible. I was using James's laptop to work on my thesis. Mine was being repaired, when a notification popped up from an app one didn't recognize. Curious, I clicked on it, and my world imploded. Dating apps. Multiple dating apps. With recent activity, recent messages, recent matches. I sat there staring at the screen, my thesis forgotten, trying to process what I was seeing. This had to be a mistake. This had to be old, from before we were together. There had to be some explanation that didn't involve the person I loved and trusted most in the world actively seeking out other women. When James came home that evening, I was sitting on our couch with his laptop open in front of me. "We need to talk," I said, and I watched his face go white as he saw what was on the screen. The conversation that followed was one of the most painful of my life. James broke down immediately, tears streaming down his face as he confessed to everything. Yes, he'd been on dating apps. Yes, he'd met up with women. Yes, he'd kissed them, held them, touched them. But I never had sex with anyone, he kept repeating, like that somehow made it better. I couldn't go through with it. Every time, I thought about you and I couldn't do it. He told me about 2 specific incidents, 2 women he'd met through the apps, 2 dates that had ended in physical intimacy but not sex. He described kissing them, holding them, the rush of new connection and attraction. But then, he claimed, guilt would overwhelm him and he'd pull back. "I still love you," he sobbed. "I never stopped loving you. That's why I couldn't go through with it completely." His explanation was that our lack of intimacy during my thesis period had left him feeling unwanted, unloved, desperate for physical connection. He painted himself as a victim of circumstances, someone who'd made mistakes but hadn't crossed the ultimate line. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw things. I wanted to ask him how he could betray 7 years of trust for some momentary physical gratification. Instead, I sat there in shock, trying to process the fact that while I'd been pouring my heart into my academic work, building what I thought was our future, he'd been actively pursuing other women. But here's the thing that still haunts me. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and the lies and the complete violation of my trust, I didn't leave. I should have. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to pack my bags and never look back. But love isn't rational. 7 years isn't something you can just throw away overnight. And James seemed genuinely remorseful, genuinely committed to making things right. "We can fix this," he promised. "I'll delete everything. I'll never do anything like this again. I love you so much, and I know I messed up, but we can get through this together." I wanted to believe him so badly that I ignored every red flag, every instinct telling me that someone who could lie and cheat for months wasn't going to suddenly become trustworthy overnight. My father had been unfaithful to my mother, and I'd grown up seeing the devastation that infidelity causes. I'd always sworn I'd never tolerate cheating in my own relationships, never be the woman who stayed with a man who betrayed her. But when you're actually in that situation, when it's your life and your love and your future on the line, it's not as simple as the principles you thought you held. I rationalized it by telling myself that he hadn't actually had sex with anyone, that he'd pulled back because he truly loved me, that this was a mistake born of loneliness rather than malicious intent. I convinced myself that if we both still loved each other, if we were both willing to work on our problems, we could overcome this. I thought our 7-year foundation was strong enough to weather this storm. I was wrong about so many things. Just when I thought we were starting to heal from the dating app betrayal, I discovered something that shook me even more deeply than the cheating. It was a few months after James's confession, and I was finally starting to feel like maybe we could rebuild our trust, when I stumbled across something on his computer that I couldn't even begin to understand. Chat logs. Dozens of them, spanning months. But these weren't with women his age, these were conversations with older men, and James was pretending to be a teenage girl. I read through message after message, watching my boyfriend craft an elaborate fictional persona, complete with fake photos, a fake backstory, and increasingly explicit conversations. These men thought they were talking to a vulnerable young woman, and James was manipulating them, leading them on, eventually asking for money. When I confronted him about it, his explanation was even more disturbing than the evidence itself. "I was doing it for you," he said. "For us. I knew you were struggling with money for your thesis materials, your research trips, all the expenses that come with graduate school. I wanted to help, but I didn't have enough money of my own." The logic was so twisted, so fundamentally wrong, that I couldn't even begin to process it. He was catfishing older men, stealing photos of real teenage girls, engaging in potentially illegal deception, and he was framing it as some kind of romantic gesture. "Those men deserved it," he added when I pressed him about the ethics of what he was doing. "They're perverts trying to take advantage of young girls. I was just taking their money instead." I stared at him, wondering how I'd spent 7 years with someone whose moral compass was so fundamentally broken. The person I thought I knew would never have engaged in this kind of deception, would never have rationalized fraud and manipulation as acts of love. But more than that, I was horrified that he thought I would want money that came from such a source. I'd rather have struggled financially than benefit from his lies and manipulation. The fact that he thought this was something I'd be grateful for showed me how little he actually understood my values, my character, my basic sense of right and wrong. "I never asked you to do this," I told him. "I never wanted money from this. How could you think I'd be okay with any of this?" But just like with the dating apps, James seemed to have an endless supply of justifications and rationalizations. In his mind, he was always the victim or the hero, never simply someone who'd made a selfish, harmful choice. And once again, despite my horror and disgust, I didn't leave. I was too deep in, too invested, too afraid of starting over. I told myself that this was aberrant behavior, that the stress of my thesis and our relationship problems had pushed him to make choices he'd never normally make. I was still trying to save a relationship that was already dead, still trying to love someone who'd shown me exactly who he really was. By the time I submitted my thesis, I was emotionally exhausted. 2 years of academic pressure combined with the ongoing stress of trying to rebuild trust with James had left me feeling hollowed out, like I was running on empty. But I was hopeful that with my thesis finally complete, we could focus on healing our relationship. I should have known that the revelations weren't over. I found the evidence almost by accident, a browser history that hadn't been properly cleared, a trail of searches and website visits that painted a picture I didn't want to see. Prostitution services. Escort websites. Massage parlors that obviously offered more than therapeutic services. The timestamps were devastating. This wasn't just recent activity, it went back 4 years. For years of our 7-year relationship, James had been regularly browsing these sites, contacting these services, engaging with sex workers. When I confronted him with the evidence, he had yet another explanation ready. "It's just a kink," he said, as if that made it okay. "I never actually met any of them. I just liked the fantasy, the conversation, the thrill of it. It's not real cheating because nothing physical happened. But I could see in the chat logs that he'd been negotiating prices, discussing services, making arrangements. Even if he'd never followed through, and I had no way of knowing whether that was true, he'd been actively pursuing these encounters for years. The pattern was becoming clear. Every time I discovered a new betrayal, James had a ready excuse, a way to minimize what he'd done, a justification that somehow made him the victim rather than the perpetrator. He was never fully accountable, never willing to acknowledge the full scope of his deception. And with each revelation, I felt like I knew him less. The man I'd fallen in love with 7 years earlier wouldn't have done any of these things. He wouldn't have cheated, wouldn't have catfished vulnerable older men, wouldn't have been secretly pursuing sex workers for years. But maybe that man had never existed. Maybe I'd been in love with a carefully constructed facade, a version of James that he presented to me while living an entirely different life behind the scenes. The realization was devastating. I'd spent 7 years building my life around someone who didn't actually exist. After the prostitution revelation, something inside me finally broke. Not my love for James, that was still there, stubborn and painful and refusing to die despite everything. But my ability to keep pretending that we could fix this, that trust could be rebuilt, that our relationship could survive this level of deception. I need a break, I told him. I need time to think, to figure out who I am outside of this relationship, to decide if I can actually live with all of this. James agreed, though I could see the panic in his eyes. For 7 years, I'd been the constant in his life, the one person who'd stayed no matter what he did, who'd forgiven every betrayal, who'd rationalized every red flag. Maybe he thought a break would be like all the other times, that I'd miss him too much, that I'd convince myself to come back, that love would be enough to overcome anything. We agreed on a month. 1 month of no contact, no visits, no relationship discussions. Just space to think and breathe and remember who we were as individuals. For the first week, I felt lost. 7 years is a long time to be part of a couple, and suddenly being alone felt foreign and frightening. I'd structured my entire adult life around James, and without him, I wasn't sure who I was supposed to be. But slowly, something started to shift. Without the constant stress of trying to rebuild trust, without the emotional labor of managing James's guilt and my own hurt, I began to remember what it felt like to just exist. To make decisions based on what I wanted rather than what would be best for our relationship. To go to bed without replaying his betrayals in my mind. The clarity was both liberating and terrifying. A month passed, and then James did something that showed me exactly where I stood in his priorities. He deleted all our photos from social media. 7 years of memories, of trips and celebrations and quiet moments, gone. When I saw our shared history disappearing from his Instagram, from his Facebook, I felt something die inside me that I hadn't even realized was still alive. Hope, maybe. Or the last remnants of belief that what we'd had was real and meaningful to him. I called him immediately. "Why did you delete everything?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've moved on," he said simply. "Not because I stopped loving you. I don't think I'll ever stop loving you. But because I love you so much that holding on to you will only hurt you more." The explanation was so perfectly James, noble sounding, self-sacrificing, designed to make him look like the hero of his own story. But underneath the pretty words, the message was clear: he was done fighting for us. "I can't give you the future you need," he continued. "I can't be the man you deserve. You'll never trust me the way you used to, and that's my fault, but it means we can't really be together anymore." He talked about my growth, about how I deserved better, about how staying together would only delay my healing. He mentioned his family, acknowledging for the first time that their treatment of me had been unfair and that he'd failed to protect me from it. "Maybe in a year," he said, "when we've both had time to grow and change, we can reconnect. As friends, at least. Maybe more, if we're both different people by then." But I could hear it in his voice: he didn't really believe that. This wasn't a strategic pause or a temporary setback. This was his way of ending things while making it sound like a loving sacrifice. The cruelest part was that he suggested staying friends, texting occasionally, maintaining some kind of connection. He wanted the comfort of knowing I was still there, still caring about him, without any of the responsibility or commitment that came with actually being in a relationship. And like an idiot, I agreed to it. We started texting occasionally, just friendly check-ins, he said. Nothing romantic or relationship-focused, just two people who'd shared 7 years trying to maintain some kind of connection. But it was torture. Pure, psychological torture. I'd wait all day for a text from him, analyzing every word when one finally came, reading meaning into the timing and tone and emoji choices. One day we'd have what felt like a real conversation, and I'd go to bed thinking maybe there was still hope. The next day, I'd get a one-word response or nothing at all, and I'd spiral into despair. The power dynamic was completely skewed. James had moved on, deleted our photos, claimed he was ready for whatever came next. But he still got to feel loved and wanted because I was always there, always responding, always hoping for more. I became pathetic in my own eyes. I was the one reaching out more often, the one trying to maintain conversation, the one clinging to the scraps of attention he threw my way. Even after everything he'd done, even after all his betrayals, I was still the one fighting for us while he passively accepted whatever level of connection I was willing to provide. It hit me that this dynamic had defined our entire relationship. I'd always been the one to push for difficult conversations, to address problems, to fight for us when things got tough. James was passive, conflict avoidant, content to let me do all the emotional labor while he went along with whatever I decided. Even in our breakup, I was doing all the work while he sat back and let me exhaust myself trying to save something he'd already given up on. Months have passed now, and I'm still struggling with questions that have no good answers. How did he move on so fast? If he really loved me as much as he claimed, how could he delete our photos and start talking about being just friends only a month after our break? Was our 7-year relationship so easy for him to walk away from? If he truly believed I deserved better, why wasn't he fighting to become better? Why wasn't he in therapy, working on his issues, trying to rebuild the trust he'd destroyed? Instead, he chose the easy path, walking away and framing it as a noble sacrifice. If I stay silent for a year like he suggested, will we really reconnect, or will we just fade away into memory? And more importantly, do I even want to reconnect with someone who's shown me so clearly that I'm not worth fighting for? I keep torturing myself with the math of our relationship. 7 years. That's longer than some people's marriages. We supported each other through college, family crises, career changes, personal growth. When he was struggling with depression in our third year, I was there every day, helping him find therapy, adjusting my schedule to accommodate his needs, never wavering in my commitment to him. But when our relationship hit its roughest patch, when the going got tough, he started looking elsewhere for comfort and connection. Instead of talking to me about feeling neglected during my thesis period, instead of suggesting counseling or making an effort to reconnect, he decided to cheat. And then, when the consequences of his choices became too much to handle, he walked away entirely. Am I focusing too much on his betrayals and not enough on the good years? Were those 5 years of happiness worth fighting for, or were they built on a foundation that was always unstable? These are the questions that keep me up at night, that make it impossible to fully let go and move on. I think the hardest part of all this is the fear of starting over at 25 with very little to show for my adult life except academic achievements and a failed long-term relationship. I've never been good at making friends. I'm introverted by nature, and during my relationship with James, I let my social circle shrink to almost nothing. He became my primary source of emotional support, entertainment, and companionship. Now that he's gone, I'm facing a level of loneliness I'm not sure I know how to handle. The thought of dating again is overwhelming. How do you learn to trust someone new when the person you trusted most in the world turned out to be living a double life? How do you open your heart again when you know how completely it can be shattered? I've been reading books, The Body Keeps the Score and Not Just Friends, trying to understand trauma and infidelity and the psychological impact of what I've been through. I'm learning about betrayal trauma, about how deception can literally rewire your brain, about why it's so hard to let go of someone who's hurt you so deeply. The books help, but they also confirm what I already suspected. This isn't something I can just get over quickly. The effects of James's betrayals will likely impact my ability to trust and love for years to come. Sometimes I wonder if there are couples out there who've successfully overcome infidelity and rebuilt their relationships. I've heard stories, read articles about people who've worked through cheating and come out stronger on the other side. But those stories seem to involve partners who were truly committed to change, who were willing to do the hard work of rebuilding trust. James was never willing to do that work. He wanted forgiveness without accountability, trust without transparency, love without effort. The truth I'm slowly coming to terms with is that the James the first fell in love with 7 years ago might never have existed. The supportive, faithful, morally upright person I thought I was building a life with was a carefully constructed persona, designed to keep me invested while he pursued his own interests behind the scenes. The real James is someone who cheats when he feels neglected instead of communicating his needs, lies easily and repeatedly, even when caught red-handed, engages in increasingly elaborate deceptions, catfishing, prostitution sites, frames his harmful behavior as somehow noble or victimized, avoids confrontation even when it means failing to protect the person he claims to love, gives up on relationships when they require real work and commitment. That person isn't someone I can build a future with, no matter how much I might love the memory of who I thought he was. The most painful realization is that I wasted 7 years, the entirety of my early 20s, on someone who was never fully present in our relationship. While I was planning our future, he was planning his escapes. While I was building trust, he was systematically destroying it. I'll always wonder what my life might have looked like if I'd had the courage to leave after the first betrayal, or if I'd never met James at all? Would I have developed a stronger sense of self? Would I have built better friendships? Would I have learned to be happy alone instead of depending so heavily on one person for my emotional well-being? But I can't change the past. I can only decide what to do with the present and the future. So here I am, 7 years later, trying to figure out who I am when I'm not half of a couple. It's terrifying and lonely and overwhelming, but it's also the first honest thing I've done in months. I'm learning to sit with the discomfort of not knowing what comes next. For 7 years, my future was tied to James's future. We'd talk about marriage, kids, career moves, where we wanted to live. All of it was we and us and our plans. Now it's just me, and I have to learn to think in terms of I and my plans and what I want. It's harder than I expected, but it's also liberating in ways I didn't anticipate. I'm starting to remember things about myself that I'd forgotten during my relationship. I like being alone with my thoughts. I enjoy having complete control over my schedule. I can watch whatever I want, eat whatever I want, make plans without consulting anyone else. These are small things, but they're helping me remember that I'm a complete person on my own, not just half of a relationship waiting for someone to make me whole. I'm also starting to understand that love isn't enough. Love without trust, respect, honesty, and commitment is just an emotion, not a foundation for a life together. James and I loved each other. I believe that was real. But love alone couldn't overcome the fundamental character differences that made us incompatible. I deserved someone who would choose me every day, not just when it was convenient. Someone who would fight for our relationship when it hit rough patches, not look for comfort elsewhere. Someone whose moral compass aligned with mine, who would never engage in the kind of deception that James normalized. That person might exist somewhere, or I might discover that I'm perfectly happy on my own. Either way, I'm finally ready to find out. The story isn't over yet. I'm still healing, still growing, still learning to trust my own instincts again. But for the first time in months, I'm not waiting for James to decide my future for me. I'm deciding it for myself.